moment Melissa signed those divorce papers, with that smug little laugh echoing through the Miami courthouse, she thought she was about to become the richest divorcee in Coral Gables. Designer heels clicking against marble floors, fresh from her morning Pilates session, she genuinely believed she'd just won the lottery. What she didn't know was that her quiet, unassuming husband had been playing a completely different game. One where silence spoke louder than any Ferrari engine roaring down Ocean Drive. You see, in a city where everyone flaunts their wealth like peacocks showing off their feathers, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who chooses to remain invisible. While Miami's elite were busy posting their yachts on Instagram and their Lamborghinis on TikTok, Preston had mastered something far more powerful: the art of strategic obscurity. He understood that real wealth whispers while fake wealth screams. This isn't just another divorce story from South Florida's playground of the rich and reckless. This is about the crushing weight of underestimating someone, about the price of betrayal when you mistake kindness for weakness, and about how the most devastating revenge sometimes comes wrapped in perfect silence. Because in Miami, where appearances are everything and reality is often nothing, Preston was about to teach his cheating wife the most expensive lesson of her life. What happens when the man everyone overlooks turns out to be the one person who should never have been ignored? Buckle up, because this story will make you question everything you think you know about power, patience, and the cost of playing games with someone who's been three-step. Preston Martinez had always been the type of man who blended into Miami's vibrant background like beige paint on a sunset wall. While his neighbors in Coral Gables drove their Maseratis to Whole Foods, he'd quietly cruised by in his reliable Honda Accord, earning him the neighborhood nickname of the IT guy who lives within his means. His daily routine was as predictable as the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the Atlantic. Coffee at 6 a.m., work by 8, home by 6, and Netflix with Melissa by 9. To everyone watching, including his wife of 7 years, Preston was the human equivalent of vanilla ice cream: safe, reliable, and thoroughly unremarkable. Melissa Santos Martinez, however, was a different story entirely. Born and raised in Miami Beach, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd grown up watching millionaires turn into billionaires over mojitos at Joe's Stone Crab. At 32, she still had the kind of curves that made heads turn at South Beach, and she knew it. Her morning routine involved personal training sessions at an exclusive Brickell gym, followed by green juice meetings with her equally ambitious girlfriends who discussed real estate investments like some people discuss the weather. The early years of their marriage had been genuinely happy, or at least Preston had thought so. They'd met at a tech conference in downtown Miami, where she was working event coordination and he was presenting some mundane software solution. She'd been charmed by his quiet intelligence, his stability in a city full of flashy guys who promised the world and delivered disappointment. Finally, a man who's not trying to impress me with his father's yacht, she'd told her friends back then, laughing as she showed off her modest engagement ring. But somewhere between year 3 and year 7, Preston noticed the shift. The way she'd roll her eyes when he'd get excited about a new coding project. How she'd sigh dramatically when friends would ask about their vacation plans, knowing they'd be driving to the Keys instead of flying to Cabo. He saw how her smile would falter slightly when introducing him at parties, as if she was already apologizing for his ordinary existence. Preston wasn't stupid. He could read the writing on the wall, written into senior lipstick and disappointment. Yet what Melissa couldn't see was that her boring husband was watching, learning, and quietly building something that would change everything. But some secrets are worth keeping, especially when the person you're keeping them from has already started macking plans of their own. How often do we mistake someone's quiet confidence for lack of ambition? The first crack in their marriage appeared on a humid Tuesday evening in August 2019. Though Preston didn't realize it at the time, Melissa had started staying later at the gym, coming home with that post-workout glow that seemed to last well into the evening. "Miguel really pushed us hard today," she'd say, toweling off her perfectly straightened hair that somehow never looked like she'd actually been sweating. Miguel Restrepo was her personal trainer, a Venezuelan ex-model who'd transitioned into fitness coaching when his modeling career hit the inevitable age wall that Miami's youth-obsessed culture demanded. Preston had met Miguel exactly once, during a chance encounter at the Publix in Coral Gables. The guy looked like he'd been carved from marble and polished with coconut oil. All white teeth and designer athletic wear that probably cost more than Preston's monthly car payment. "Your wife is incredibly dedicated," Miguel had said with that practiced smile, the kind that made women feel special and men feel invisible. Preston had simply nodded, shaken the man's perfectly manicured hand, and continued shopping for the organic kale that Melissa had specifically requested. What Preston didn't know was that Melissa's dedication had evolved beyond simple fitness goals. Those late gym sessions had morphed into something else entirely. Stolen moments in Miguel's Mercedes parked behind the Biscayne Bay overlook, text messages deleted faster than Miami traffic moved during rush hour, and elaborate stories about new workout regimens that required increasingly flexible schedules. Melissa had convinced herself she deserved this excitement, this passion that her marriage no longer revided. Meanwhile, Preston was building something far more substantial than his wife realized. His day job at a mid-sized tech firm in Aventura was exactly as mundane as it appeared, fixing servers, updating software, and attending mind-numbing meetings about synergy and paradigm shifts. But his nights belonged to something entirely different. While Melissa thought he was playing video games or watching documentaries about cryptocurrency, Preston was actually coding the foundation of what would become InnovaTech Solutions, a software platform that would revolutionize how small businesses manage their digital presence. The irony wasn't lost on him even then. As his wife was busy creating elaborate deceptions to hide her affair, Preston was quietly laying the groundwork for a future that would make her current betrayal look like child's play. He'd incorporated the business under a holding company, kept every financial detail separate from their joint accounts, and never once mentioned his late-night entrepreneurial activities. In a city where everyone talked big and delivered small, Preston had chosen the opposite approach. Some of the most dangerous storms in Miami develop quietly offshore, invisible until they're already devastating the coast. What would you do if you discovered that while you were building your future, someone else was busy destroying it? By December 2019, the signs had become impossible to ignore. Not that Preston was trying particularly hard to miss them anymore. Melissa's phone had acquired a life of its own, buzzing with messages at all hours, face down on nightstands, and protected by a new passcode that she'd forgotten to mention changing. Her gym bag had started containing items that had nothing to do with working out. Expensive lingerie that never seemed to make it into their bedroom, perfume samples from Sephora, and receipts for restaurants Preston had never heard of, much less visited. The most telling change, however, was in how Melissa talked about their future. Conversations that once included phrases like, "when we buy our dream house in Pinecrest," had gradually shifted to, "when I figure out what I really want to do with my life." She'd started making comments about feeling trapped and unfulfilled, usually while scrolling through Instagram posts of their wealthier friends showing off their latest acquisitions. Preston would nod sympathetically, offering support and understanding, while noting how her definition of fulfillment seemed to coincide perfectly with her training schedule. The breaking point came during their annual New Year's Eve party at the Fontainebleau. Preston had splurged on a nice hotel room, hoping to recapture some of the magic from their earlier years together. As midnight approached and fireworks lit up Biscayne Bay, Melissa spent more time texting than talking, her fingers flying across her phone screen with the urgency of someone conducting international business negotiations. When Preston gently asked who was so important on New Year's Eve, she'd snapped that IT was just work stuff, a particularly creative lie considering her event coordination job had been slow for the past 6 months. What Melissa didn't realize was that while she was busy managing her double life, Preston's software platform had just landed its first major client, a chain of boutique hotels throughout South Florida, who were paying $50,000 annually for his digital management solutions. The contract had been signed 3 days before Christmas, but Preston had celebrated alone with a quiet cup of coffee and a satisfied smile. No Instagram posts, no champagne photos, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his patience and hard work were finally paying dividends. That same week, while Melissa was busy coordinating her lies and Preston was depositing his first major business payment into an account she knew nothing about, Innovatech Solutions received its second client inquiry. This one came from a restaurant group in Orlando, and they were talking numbers that would have made Melissa's jaw drop if she'd been paying attention to anyone other than Miguel's perfectly crafted text messages. Sometimes the most significant victories happen in complete silence, while the most devastating defeats are broadcast to the world. How many opportunities do we miss because we're too busy looking in the wrong direction? Chapter 4. The pandemic that shut down Miami in March 2020 turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to Preston's business, and the worst thing that ever happened to Melissa's affair. With gyms closed and social distancing mandated, her elaborate cover story crumbled faster than a sandcastle at high tide. Suddenly, she was trapped at home with the husband she'd been systematically deceiving, while her muscular Escape route was quarantined somewhere in Aventura, probably doing virtual training sessions with other bored housewives. Preston, meanwhile, was experiencing a professional renaissance that would have made Silicon Valley entrepreneurs weep with envy. As businesses scrambled to move their operations online, Innovatech Solutions became the digital lifeline that dozens of companies desperately needed. Restaurant owners who'd never heard of cloud computing were suddenly begging for Preston's help in setting up delivery platforms. Retail stores that had resisted e-commerce for decades were offering premium rates for immediate web's IT development. By May 2020, Preston was turning down clients because he literally couldn't handle the demand fast enough. The contrast between their pandemic experiences couldn't have been more stark. Melissa spent her days pacing their Coral Gables home like a caged panther, alternating between yoga videos and increasingly creative excuses for why she needed to make essential trips to Target. Her mood swings became legendary, sunny and affectionate one moment, cold and distant the next, depending on whether Miguel had responded to her latest message or was busy with his own lockdown complications. Preston watched this emotional roller coaster with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly volatile species. Meanwhile, Preston's bank account was growing at a rate that would have made Miami's real estate speculators jealous. Each new client meant another $30,000 to $100,000 in annual revenue, and the contracts were piling up faster than hurricane preparation SUAPLEs at Home Depot. He'd upgraded his home office setup, invested in better equipment, and even hired 2 remote contractors to help handle the overflow, all while maintaining the illusion that he was just another work-from-home employee grateful to still have a paycheck. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on him. While Melissa was mourning the temporary loss of her secret romance, Preston was building the financial foundation that would make their eventual divorce the most expensive mistake of her life. Every day that she spent sighing dramatically about being cooped up was another day that his hidden empire grew stronger, more valuable, and more completely beyond her reach. The most dangerous predators are often the ones that hunt in complete silence, striking only when their prey is most vulnerable. What would you choose? Temporary pleasure that you have to hide, or permanent success that you can keep secret? Chapter 5. By summer 2020, as Miami began its cautious reopening, Melissa had transformed into a woman on a mission. Gyms were operating at limited capacity, but Miguel's training sessions had resumed with a vengeance, and apparently required twice as much recovery time as before the pandemic. She'd developed an impressive vocabulary of fitness terminology, discussing muscle groups and nutrition plans with the enthusiasm of someone preparing for the Olympics, rather than simply trying to maintain her figure for her increasingly distant husband. Preston had to admire her creativity, even as it confirmed his worst suspicions. Melissa's post-workout stories became increasingly elaborate, how Miguel was helping her with specialized stretching techniques that required extended sessions, how they discovered this amazing new protein bar cafe that inexplicably had terrible cell phone reception, and how her new workout routine demanded complete focus, meaning she couldn't be disturbed during her sessions. She'd return home glowing with that particular radiance that had nothing to do with cardiovascular exercise and everything to do with the kind of cardio that didn't happen at the gym. What made the situation almost comedic was how Melissa had convinced herself she was being subtle. Preston would watch her craft these elaborate explanations with the focus of a novelist, never realizing that her husband had stopped believing her months ago. She'd delete text messages with the urgency of someone disposing of evidence, not knowing that Preston had long since stopped caring about her digital footprints. He was far too busy tracking something much more important: the exponential growth of his business empire. Innovatech Solutions had reached a milestone that summer that Preston celebrated alone with a quiet dinner and a glass of wine, while Melissa was attending what she called a fitness seminar in South Beach. His company had just signed its 50th client, pushing annual revenue past the 7-figure mark. The software platform that had started as late-night coding sessions was now generating more money than most small businesses saw in a decade. Preston had achieved something that 95% of entrepreneurs never reached: a genuinely profitable, scalable business that operated almost entirely without his daily involvement. The contractors he'd hired had proven so effective that Preston barely needed to work more than a few hours per day to keep everything running smoothly. This gave him plenty of time to think, to plan, and to watch his wife dig herself deeper into a hole that she didn't even realize she was creating. Every lie she told, every excuse she made, every moment she spent building her secret romance was another brick in the wall that would eventually crumble and bury her hopes of profiting from their marriage. The most successful hunters know that patience isn't passive. It's the active choice to wait for the perfect moment to strike. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, how long should you wait before believing them? The autumn of 2020 brought two significant developments to the Martinez household, though only one of them was visible to Melissa. The obvious change was her increasingly bold behavior. Training sessions that lasted entire afternoons, weekend nutrition workshops that conveniently coincided with Miguel's competition prep schedule, and a sudden interest in couples therapy, which she suggested might help them reconnect while simultaneously planning her exit strategy. The invisible change was far more substantial. Preston had just received a buyout offer for Innovatech Solutions that would have made him financially independent for life. A larger tech firm in Atlanta had approached him through intermediaries, offering $5 million for his company and client base. Preston had politely declined, not because the offer wasn't generous, but because his financial projections showed the company would be worth significantly more within 2 years. In a city where people mortgaged their futures for the appearance of wealth, Preston was building actual wealth with the methodical precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Melissa's therapy suggestion had actually been brilliant, though not for the reasons she intended. Preston agreed enthusiastically, curious to see how his wife would navigate discussing their marriage problems with a professional while carefully avoiding a NY mention of her extracurricular activities. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, their couples therapist in Coconut Grove, quickly identified the core issue. Melissa felt emotionally disconnected from Preston and believed he lacked ambition for their future together. Preston nodded thoughtfully, expressing his commitment to being more present and engaged in their relationship. What made these sessions fascinating was watching Melissa perform emotional vulnerability while carefully editing her reality. She'd discuss feeling unfulfilled and invisible in their marriage, describing a husband who was kind but unexciting, stable but unambitious. Preston would listen with genuine interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his commitment to understanding her perspective. Dr. Hoffman was impressed by his emotional maturity and willingness to accept responsibility for their problems. If only she'd known that Preston was simultaneously running a multi-million-dollar business from the laptop in their bedroom. The therapeutic breakthrough came in November, when Melissa tearfully admitted that she'd been questioning everything about their life together. She felt like she was wasting her prime years with someone who would never give her the excitement and success she deserved. Preston reached across the couch, took her hand, and said something that would later prove prophetic. "Melissa, I want you to have everything you deserve from life, and I promise you, very soon, you'll get exactly that." Dr. Hoffman noted Preston's response as a beautiful example of unconditional love and support. Melissa squeezed his hand and smiled through her tears, believing she'd just received permission to blow up their marriage. Neither woman realized that Preston H. had just delivered the most ominous promise in the history of couples therapy. The most dangerous words ever spoken are often the ones that sound the most loving. How do you know when someone is fighting for your relationship? Christmas 2020 in the Martinez household was a masterpiece of performed normalcy. Melissa had outdone herself with decorations, transforming their Coral Gables home into something that could have graced the pages of Southern Living magazine. She'd insisted on hosting her parents and Preston's family for Christmas Eve dinner, playing the role of devoted wife with Academy Award-worthy commitment. Preston watched the performance with genuine admiration. She'd managed to coordinate a 7-course meal while fielding text messages from Miguel, who was apparently spending the holidays visiting family in Venezuela, but somehow had remarkable cell phone service for someone dealing with that country's infrastructure challenges. The gift exchange revealed everything anyone needed to know about the state of their marriage. Melissa presented Preston with a sleek laptop bag and a subscription to a productivity app, gifts that screamed, "I hope this helps you become more successful than you currently are." Preston, meanwhile, had given Melissa diamond earrings that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, a purchase he could easily afford thanks to Innovatech's December revenue surge, though Melissa assumed he'd stretched their budget to the breaking point. Her surprise was genuine, her gratitude effusive, and her confusion complete. How could her boring husband afford such extravagance? What Melissa didn't know was that December 2020 had been Innovatech's most profitable month yet. The holiday season had driven a surge in e-commerce demand that pushed Preston's revenue past $200,000 for a single month. He'd celebrated this milestone alone, on a late-night walk through their neighborhood, watching Christmas lights twinkle in million-dollar homes whose owners probably earned less than his hidden business was generating. The irony was perfect. While his neighbors flaunted their wealth through elaborate light displays and luxury cars, Preston's actual success remained invisible, growing stronger with each passing day. The new year brought Melissa's most audacious move yet. She announced that she'd decided to pursue a fitness certification that would require intensive weekend training sessions throughout the spring. This certification, she explained with straight-faced conviction, would allow her to eventually open her own studio and contribute more meaningfully to their financial future. Preston listened with the attentiveness of a loving husband, asking detailed questions about the curriculum and offering complete support for her new career direction. He even suggested they set aside money for her certification costs, money that came from an account she knew nothing about. Meanwhile, Preston had been approached by a second potential buyer, this one offering $12 million for Innovatech Solutions. Again, he declined, but this time he began planning something more strategic. If Melissa wanted to pursue her new career in fitness, Preston would make sure she had every opportunity to succeed. After all, he'd promised her that she would get exactly what she deserved from life. The most generous gifts are sometimes the ones that allow people to reveal their true character. What's more valuable? Someone who supports. Spring 2021 marked the beginning of what Preston privately called the documentation phase. Melissa's fitness certification program had provided her with the perfect cover for increasingly brazen behavior. She'd leave the house at dawn on Saturdays, claiming she needed to practice her training techniques with Miguel before the official classes began. These practice sessions apparently required such intense focus that she'd turn off her phone for hours at a time, emerging from her educational experience with that particular glow that had nothing to do with learning proper squat form. Preston began paying attention to details with the methodical precision that had made his business successful. He noted the mileage on Melissa's car, which never quite matched the distance to her supposed certification venue. He observed how her workout clothes would sometimes smell like expensive cologne rather than sweat, and how she'd developed an impressive collection of new lingerie that apparently boosted her confidence for training sessions. Most telling of all, he watched her craft increasingly elaborate stories about her classmates, creating entire fictional personalities for the other women in her program, who somehow never seemed available for the social gatherings Melissa had promised to organize. What made this period particularly interesting was that Innovatech Solutions was simultaneously experiencing its most explosive growth yet. Preston had expanded into artificial intelligence consulting, helping businesses automate their customer service operations. The AI boom had made his relatively simple platform incredibly valuable, and clients were paying premium rates for implementations that Preston could complete in his sleep. By April 2021, he was earning more in a single month than his official sale array provided in an entire year. The contrast between his wife's deception and his own business success created a strange sense of balance in Preston's life. While Melissa was busy constructing elaborate lies about her whereabouts, Preston was building genuine value that would outlast any marriage. Her energy went into maintaining her affair. His energy went into creating a legacy. She was focused on immediate gratification. He was focused on long-term consequences. The philosophical differences couldn't have been clearer. Preston celebrated Innovatech's $15 million valuation the same weekend that Melissa announced she'd passed her first certification exam. They went to dinner at Nobu in South Beach, where she talked excitedly about her new career prospects while Preston smiled and ordered another bottle of champagne. The champagne was for his business milestone. The smile was for knowing that Melissa's celebration would be very, very short-lived. The most successful strategy is often to let your opponents defeat themselves while you build something unshakable. How do you maintain your integrity when everyone around you seems to have lost theirs? Chapter 9. Summer 2021 brought an unexpected twist that would later prove crucial to Preston's ultimate victory. Melissa had announced that she was ready to take their relationship to the next level by purchasing a larger home in Pinecrest, one of Miami's most exclusive neighborhoods. She'd spent weeks researching properties online, creating elaborate Pinterest boards of dream homes, and scheduling tours of houses that cost upwards of $2 million. Her logic was simple. Preston's stable income, combined with her upcoming fitness career, would qualify them for a mortgage that will elevate their lifestyle to match their true potential. What made this development particularly amusing was Melissa's assumption that they'd need to stretch financially to afford their dream home. She'd calculated their debt-to-income ratio based on Preston's official salary, factoring in the additional revenue she expected to generate from her new fitness business. Her spreadsheets were works of art, color, coded and detailed, showing exactly how they could afford a $8 million mortgage if they were willing to make some sacrifices. Preston listened to these financial presentations with the same attentiveness he'd given her fitness certification stories, nodding thoughtfully and agreeing that their future looked bright indeed. Meanwhile, Preston had reached a decision point with Innovatech Solutions. The company's value had grown to approximately $18 million, and he was fielding acquisition offers almost weekly. Rather than selling, however, he'd chosen to restructure the business in a way that would maximize his control and minimize any potential claims on the company's value. Working with a business attorney in downtown Miami, Preston had created a complex but completely legal structure that placed Innovatech's assets in a trustee, with himself as the primary beneficiary. The paperwork was filed in Delaware, the transactions were documented in Nevada, and the profits flowed through accounts that Melissa couldn't access even if she knew they existed. The house hunting process provided Preston with hours of entertainment. Melissa would tour magnificent properties, taking photos and videos to share with her friends, completely unaware that her husband could afford to purchase any of these homes with cash. Her excitement was genuine, her plans elaborate, and her assumptions about their financial limitations adorably naive. Preston found himself genuinely hoping she'd find something she truly loved, because very soon she'd need new living arrangements, and it would be helpful if she'd already done the research. The most beautiful part of Melissa's house hunting obsession was how it revealed her true priorities. Every property she favored was chosen for its Instagram potential. Infinity pools that would photograph beautifully, wine cellars that would impress her friends, and master suites that would provide the perfect backdrop for the lifestyle she planned to build with Miguel once Preston was out of the picture. Sometimes the best way to understand someone's intentions is to watch what they do when they think they're planning your mutual future. What does it tell you? The autumn of 2021 delivered the breakthrough moment that Preston had been patiently waiting for. Melissa's fitness certification program had officially ended, but somehow her intensive training schedule with Miguel had become more demanding than ever. She'd announced that she was now working toward an advanced specialization that required even more individual attention, preferably in private settings where she could focus without distraction. Preston had congratulated her on her dedication, noting how FEW people were willing to pursue excellence with such single-minded determination. What Melissa didn't realize was that Preston had been conducting his own form of research. Through completely legal means, public records, social media investigations, and casual conversations with mutual acquaintances, he'd learned that Miguel's Persona L training business was struggling financially. The Venezuelan trainer had expensive tastes that didn't align with his actual earning potential, and he'd been supplementing his income through relationships with wealthy clients who appreciated his discretio and as much as his physical conditioning expertise. Melissa wasn't Miguel's first married client, and she certainly wouldn't be his last. This discovery had prompted Preston to make one of the most strategic decisions of his life. Rather than confronting Melissa about her affair, he'd chosen to accelerate his own timeline. Innovatech Solutions received its largest acquisition offer yet in October 2021, $22 million from a consortium of investors who wanted to expand into the Latin American market. Preston accepted the offer, but with conditions that would ensure his continued control over the company's direction and profits. The sale was structured as a licensing agreement with performance bonuses, meaning Preston would receive immediate liquidity while maintaining long-term earning potential. The closing took place on a Thursday afternoon in November, exactly 7 years after Preston and Melissa's wedding anniversary. While his wife was attending what she called a nutrition seminar in Key Biscayne, Preston was signing documents that made him worth approximately $11, $8 million after taxes. He celebrated with a quiet lunch at Joe's Stone Crab, the same restaurant where Melissa often met her girlfriends to discuss their various relationship dramas. The irony of the location wasn't lost on him. That evening, Melissa returned home excited about her seminar experience and eager to share what she'd learned about optimizing metabolic efficiency through targeted protein timing. Preston listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and praising her commitment to professional development. After dinner, as they sat on their back patio overlooking the canal, Melissa mentioned that she'd been thinking about their future together. She felt ready, she said, to have an honest conversation about what they both really wanted from life. Preston agreed completely. Honesty, he assured her, was exactly what their relationship needed. Very soon, they'd both have the opportunity to be more honest than they'd ever been before. The most dangerous conversations are the ones that begin with someone asking for honesty while hiding their biggest lies. How do you prepare for a conversation when you know the other person has already decided? December 2021 was when Melissa finally revealed her hand, though not in the way she'd originally planned. What was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated conversation about growing apart and needing space to find herself Instead, became a clumsy admission that she'd met someone who made her feel alive again in ways that Preston apparently never could. The conversation took place on a Sunday morning, over coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery in Coconut Grove, as if discussing the destruction of their marriage was just another pleasant weekend activity. Melissa had clearly rehearsed her speech, but her execution lacked the finesse she'd demonstrated in other areas of deception. She talked about how they'd become different people over the past 7 years, how she'd discovered that she needed passion and excitement in ways that their stable relationship couldn't provide. She mentioned Miguel by name, describing him as someone who'd helped her realize her potential, both physically and emotionally. Preston listened with the patience of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for months, occasionally nodding and asking clarifying questions that suggested genuine concern for her happiness. What made the conversation particularly surreal was Melissa's assumption that Preston would be devastated by her revelation. She'd prepared for tears, anger, maybe even desperate pleas for reconciliation. Instead, Preston thanked her for her honesty and agreed that they'd both probably be happier pursuing relationships that better matched their individual needs. His calm acceptance threw Melissa completely off script. She'd expected to comfort a broken man, not negotiate logistics with someone who seemed almost relieved by her announcement. The discussion of practical matters revealed just how thoroughly Melissa had misunderstood their financial situation. She talked about splitting their assets fairly, assuming they'd sell the house and divide the proceeds, along with their modest savings and retirement accounts. Preston agreed that fairness was crucial and suggested they each consult attorneys to ensure everything was handled properly. Melissa seemed surprised by his reasonableness, having expected a much more contentious process. She even offered to help find him a nice apartment in a good neighborhood, since she'd planned to keep the house temporarily while figuring out her next steps with Miguel. Preston's only moment of genuine emotion came when Melissa mentioned that she hoped they could remain friends after the divorce was finalized. He'd looked at her with something that might have been sadness or possibly pity, and said quietly that he hoped she'd find everything she was looking for in life. It was the closest thing to vulnerability he'd shown during their entire conversation, and it made Melissa feel slightly guilty about destroying their marriage for something as pedestrian as better sex and more excitement. The most revealing moments in any relationship come when people think they're being generous while actually being selfish. What does it say about someone when they destroy something stable to chase something temporary? Chapter 12. January 2022 marked the beginning of what Preston privately referred to as the paperwork phase. Melissa had moved quickly to file for divorce, apparently eager to formalize her freedom and begin her new life with Miguel, without the inconvenience of an inconvenient husband. She'd hired Rebecca Goldman, a divorce attorney in Brickell who specialized in representing wives seeking significant settlements from successful husbands. The choice of attorney revealed everything about Melissa's expectations. She wasn't planning to leave the marriage empty-handed. What made Melissa's legal strategy particularly fascinating was her conviction that Preston had been hiding assets throughout their marriage. Rebecca had apparently convinced her that quiet, stable husbands were often the most financially deceptive, accumulating wealth through secret investments and business ventures that their wives never suspected. The attorney had encouraged Melissa to demand full financial disclosure, including tax returns, bank statements, and investment records going back 7 years. Melissa was confident this investigation would reveal the comfortable nest egg that Preston had surely been building for their retirement. Preston's response to these demands was refreshingly straightforward. He provided every document his wife's attorney requested, along with several additional financial records that nobody had asked for. His tax returns showed exactly what Melissa expected: a modest but steady salary from his IT job, reasonable retirement contributions, and the kind of boring financial profile that suggested a man who lived within his means and planned responsibly for the future. Rebecca Goldman reviewed the documentation with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant, searching for hidden trusts, offshore accounts, or business interests that might have escaped initial detection. The attorney's investigation did uncover one interesting detail. Preston had been making regular payments to something called Innovatech Solutions LLC, which appeared to be some kind of technology consulting firm. When questioned about these payments, Preston explained that he'd been hiring the company to help with various software projects related to his day job. The payments were relatively modest, a few $1,000s per month, and seemed consistent with someone who occasionally outsourced technical work that exceeded his individual capabilities. What Rebecca Goldman's investigation failed to discover was that Preston owned Innovatech Solutions LLC, along with the holding companies that controlled its assets and the trust structures that protected its profits. The payments Melissa's attorney had identified weren't Preston hiring an outside consultant. They were Preston paying himself through a business entity that existed in a completely different legal universe than their marriage. The documentation was flawless, the structure was perfectly legal, and the oversight was invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for and where to look for it. The most successful hiding places are often the ones that remain visible to everyone while being understood by no one. What happens when someone demands to see everything you have while remaining blind to what they're actually looking for? Spring 2022 brought an unexpected complication to Melissa's divorce plans, though she initially interpreted it as a stroke of good fortune. Miguel had announced that he was ready to make their relationship official, and he'd suggested that Melissa accelerated her divorce proceedings so they could begin building a life together without the awkwardness of her still being legally married to another man. His proposal came with a romantic gesture that was perfectly calibrated to Melissa's Instagram aesthetic, a weekend getaway to a boutique resort in the Keys, complete with sunset photos and champagne toasts that generated dozens of comments from friends who praised her for finally choosing happiness. What Melissa didn't know was that Miguel's sudden urgency about formalizing their relationship had less to do with romance and more to do with his increasingly desperate financial situation. His personal training business had lost several major clients during the pandemic, and his expensive lifestyle was being maintained through credit cards and the generosity of women like Melissa, who believed they were investing in a future together. Miguel had convinced himself that once Melissa's divorce was finalized, her settlement would provide the financial stability that his business career had failed to deliver. Meanwhile, Preston was experiencing a different kind of relationship milestone. He'd begun dating Sarah Chen, a pediatric surgeon at Miami Children's Hospital who appreciated his intelligence, stability, and complete lack of interest in impressing people with borrowed wealth or exaggerated accomplishments. Sarah had no idea about Preston's business success. She'd fallen for the same modest, reliable persona that had initially attracted Melissa 7 years earlier. The difference was that Sarah found these qualities attractive rather than disappointing, seeing Preston's quiet confidence as evidence of genuine substance rather than lack of ambition. The irony of Preston's new relationship wasn't lost on him. While Melissa was planning a future with a man who saw her as a financial solution to his problems, Preston was building something with a woman who would love him regardless of his bank account balance. Sarah earned a substantial salary as a surgeon and had her own investment portfolio. She didn't need Preston's money, which made her affection for him refreshingly uncomplicated. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of genuine compatibility that Melissa had convinced herself was less important than passion and excitement. The contrast between the two relationships became evident during a chance encounter at Lincoln Road one Saturday afternoon. Preston and Sarah were browsing books at a small independent bookstore when Melissa and Miguel appeared, clearly in the middle of an Instagram photo session designed to showcase their glamorous South Beach lifestyle. The meeting was awkward but brief. Polite introductions, pleasant small talk about the weather, and careful avoidance of any topics that might create tension. What struck Preston was how exhausted Melissa looked beneath her carefully applied makeup, as if maintaining her new life required more energy than she'd anticipated. After Melissa and Miguel left, Sarah had commented that Preston's ex-wife seemed like someone who was trying very hard to be happy. rather than someone who actually was happy. The observation was astute and generous, lacking the cattiness that might have been expected from a woman meeting her boyfriend's soon-to-be ex-wife. Preston had simply nodded, thinking about how different his life might have been if he'd met Sarah 7 years earlier, before Melissa had taught him the value of keeping his most important secrets to himself. Sometimes the most profound relationships are the ones that develop without drama, manipulation, or the need to prove anything to anyone else. What's the difference between someone who chooses you for who you are versus someone who chooses you for what you might become? Chapter 14. Summer 2022. Summer 2022 delivered the moment that would define the rest of Melissa's life, though she was too busy planning her post-divorce celebration to recognize the approaching disaster. Her attorney had finally completed the financial investigation and concluded that Preston was exactly what he appeared to be, a stable middle-class man with modest assets and no hidden wealth. Rebecca Goldman had reluctantly advised Melissa that her expectations for the settlement might need to be adjusted downward, since there simply wasn't enough marital property to justify the aggressive approach they'd initially planned. Melissa's response to this news revealed the depth of her delusion about their marriage. She'd become convinced that Preston must be hiding assets somewhere, possibly in cryptocurrency investments or offshore accounts that her attorney hadn't been sophisticated enough to discover. She'd even hired a private investigator to follow Preston for a week, hoping to catch him meeting with financial advisors or visiting banks that didn't appear on their joint account statements. The investigation had yielded nothing more interesting than Preston's regular routine: work, grocery shopping, dinner dates with his new girlfriend, and quiet evenings at home. What Melissa's private investigator had failed to recognize was that Preston's most important meetings were taking place virtually, through video conferences with his business partners and investment advisors who managed Innovatech's expanding portfolio. Teehee holding companies that controlled his wealth were administered by professionals in Delaware and Nevada, people who handled his affairs with the discretion that substantial clients expected. Preston's physical movements were unremarkable because his financial empire existed entirely in the digital realm, managed through encrypted communications and electronic signatures that left no trace in the physical world. The private investigator's report had actually strengthened Preston's position by documenting his apparently modest lifestyle. Photos showed him shopping at regular grocery stores, eating at middle-tier restaurants, and driving his reliable Honda Accord to and from his ordinary job. The investigator had noted Preston's relationship with Sarah, describing her as a professional woman who appears financially independent, which suggested that Preston wasn't being supported by his new girlfriend's income. Overall, the report painted a picture of a man whose lifestyle was entirely consistent with his reported income. This documentation would later prove crucial when Melissa's attorney attempted to argue that Preston's calm acceptance of the divorce indicated he was hiding substantial assets. How could a man be so relaxed about losing his wife unless he had secret wealth that would cushion the financial impact? Preston's lawyer would use the private investigator's own report to demonstrate that his client's behavior was entirely consistent with someone who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from ending an unhappy marriage. The most expensive mistakes are often the ones that feel like smart investments at the time. How do you know when your search for the truth is actually leading you further away from reality? Chapter 15. October 2022 marked the final phase of Preston's long-term strategy, though Melissa remained blissfully unaware that she was walking into the most expensive trap of her life. The divorce proceedings had been scheduled for November, and Melissa's confidence had reached almost manic levels. She'd already signed a lease on a luxury apartment in Brickell, planning to move in immediately after the settlement was finalized. Miguel had been supportive of these arrangements, especially since Melissa had assured him that her divorce settlement would easily cover their living expenses while his personal training business recovered from its recent setbacks. Melissa's celebration plans were elaborate and social, media-ready. She'd organized a divorce party, at one of South Beach's trendiest rooftops, complete with custom cocktails named after her newfound freedom and a guest list that included every friend who'd supported her decision to leave her boring marriage. The party invitations featured photos of Melissa and Miguel looking glamorous and successful, with captions about choosing authentic happiness and living life without compromise. The event was scheduled for the weekend after the final court hearing, assuming everything went according to her expectations. What made Melissa's confidence particularly ironic was that she'd spent the weeks leading up to the hearing shopping for furniture and decorations for her new apartment. She'd purchased everything on credit, assuming her settlement would more than cover the expenses once the paperwork was finalized. Her Instagram stories featured endless photos of designer furniture deliveries, custom artwork installations, and premium kitchen appliances that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Miguel had been helpful with the heavy lifting, though he'd seemed increasingly nervous about the mounting expenses. Preston, meanwhile, had been making his own preparations, though they were considerably more substantial than furniture shopping. Innovatech Solutions had just completed its acquisition of two smaller competitors, expanding the company's market reach and pushing its valuation past $25 million. The acquisition had been funded entirely through Innovatech's existing cash flow, demonstrating the kind of financial strength that would have made Melissa's head spin if she'd been aware of it. Preston celebrated the milestone with a quiet dinner with Sarah, who still believed her boyfriend was simply a talented IT professional with good long-term prospects. The contrast between Melissa's public celebration of her impending freedom and Preston's private satisfaction with his growing empire was perfect. She was broadcasting her victory before the game was over. He was quietly ensuring that when the final score was announced, there would be no question about who had actually won. Her strategy was based on assumption and wishful thinking. His strategy was based on preparation and legal certainty. The most dangerous moment in any competition is when you think you've already won while your opponent is still playing. What happens when your victory party is scheduled before you've actually achieved victory? Chapter 16, November 15th, 2022, dawned clear and bright in Miami, the kind of perfect weather that made tourists understand why people paid premium prices to live in paradise. Melissa had chosen her courtroom outfit with the same attention to detail that brides devoted to their wedding dresses. A designer suit that projected confidence and success, jewelry that suggested she was accustomed to the finer things in life, and makeup that would photograph beautifully for the social media posts she planned to share after her victory. She'd even brought a small camera crew, friends who were documenting her journey to authentic happiness for a potential reality show pitch. Preston's appearance was characteristically understated. A simple navy suit, minimal accessories, and the calm demeanor of someone attending a routine business meeting rather than the dissolution of a 7-year marriage. Sarah had offered to attend for morale support, but Preston had declined, explaining that some experiences were better faced alone. His attorney, David Ramos, was a soft-spoken man who specialized in complex asset protection cases, though his expertise in that area wouldn't become apparent until much later in the proceedings. The courtroom was smaller than Melissa had expected, lacking the dramatic grandeur she'd imagined from watching legal dramas on television. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been handling family law cases for over 2 decades, long enough to recognize the difference between genuine marital dissolution and elaborate performance art. She reviewed the preliminary paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human greed and self-deception disguised as legitimate legal proceedings. Melissa's attorney presented her case with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the advantages. Rebecca Goldman outlined her client's contributions to the marriage, her reasonable expectations for the settlement, and her need for spousal support while transitioning to financial independence through her new fitness career. The presentation was polished and professional, though it relied heavily on assumptions about marital assets that had never been properly verified. Goldman's confidence was infectious. Even Melissa began to relax. convinced that the proceedings were following her anticipated script. Preston's attorney made no opening statement, indicating that his client would respond to specific claims as they arose during the proceedings. This passive approach seemed to confirm Melissa's expectations that Preston would accept whatever settlement the court deemed fair, probably while expressing gratitude that she wasn't demanding even more. Her smile grew broader as she imagined how surprised her friends would be when she revealed the size of her settlement during her divorce party that weekend. The most beautiful moments often come just before everything changes forever. How do you prepare for the moment when your entire understanding of reality is about? The transformation began when Judge Hernandez asked for complete financial disclosure from both parties, a routine request that should have been the most boring part of the proceedings. Melissa's attorney presented their familiar documentation: modest bank statements, reasonable retirement accounts, and the mortgage details for their Coral Gables home. Everything was exactly as expected, confirming the financial picture that had shaped Melissa's settlement expectations for the past year. She glanced at Preston with something approaching sympathy, almost feeling guilty about taking such a large percentage of their modest assets. Preston's attorney then approached the bench with a folder that was considerably thicker than anyone had anticipated. David Ramos began by presenting the standard financial documents that matched Melissa's expectations: the same bank statements, the same retirement accounts, the same mortgage information. But then he continued, producing a second set of documents that would prove to be the most expensive papers Melissa had ever seen. These documents outlined Preston's ownership of Innovatech Solutions LLC, along with the complex web of holding companies, trust structures, and investment vehicles that comprised his hidden empire. Judge Hernandez's eyebrows rose slightly as she reviewed the documentation, though her professional demeanor remained unchanged. She asked several clarifying questions about the business structure, the timeline of asset acquisition, and the legal mechanism that had kept these assets separate from the marital estate. Preston's attorney answered each question with the precision of someone who'd anticipated every possible inquiry, providing additional documentation that supported every claim and explained every legal decision that had shaped the asset protection strategy. Melissa's world began to collapse as the numbers became clear. Innovatech Solutions wasn't just a small consulting firm, it was a multi-million-dollar technology company with clients throughout the United States and Latin America. The business had been generating substantial revenue for over 3 years, with profits that exceeded Preston's official salary by factors that made Melissa's head spin. The holding companies controlled real estate investments, stock portfolios, and intellectual property rights. ET had been accumulating value while she'd been planning her escape from their modest lifestyle. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Preston's attorney produced a document that Melissa had completely forgotten about: the prenuptial agreement they'd signed in 2016, back when she'd been so eager to marry her stable, reliable boyfriend T-Hat, she'd barely glanced at the legal paperwork. The prenup specifically protected any business assets that Preston had created before or during their marriage, provided those assets remained separate from their joint finances. Every dollar that Innovatech had ever earned was legally and completely beyond Melissa's reach. The moment when someone realizes they've been playing an entirely different game than they thought they were playing is always unforgettable. What's worse, losing something you thought you had, or discovering you never had it in the first place. Chapter 18. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Melissa's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself out of water. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the scowl draining from her face as the full implications of Preston's revelations settled into her consciousness. The designer suit that had made her feel confident and powerful now seemed like a costume she'd worn to the wrong party, expensive and ridiculous in equal measure. Rebecca Goldman attempted to mount a legal challenge, arguing that the prenuptial agreement might be invalid due to insufficient disclosure of assets at the time of signing. But Preston's attorney was prepared for this objection, producing documentation, They had showed Preston had properly disclosed his business plans and potential intellectual property development in the original prenup language. The agreement had been deliberately broad, protecting not just existing assets, but any business ventures that might develop from Preston's technical expertise. Melissa had signed away her claim to millions of dollars that didn't even exist yet, but which her husband had been smart enough to anticipate. Judge Hernandez reviewed the prenuptial agreement with the thoroughness that such a substantial asset protection case demanded. The document was flawless, properly witnessed, adequately disclosed, and legally sound in every respect. Moreover, Preston's BU-SINES records showed that he'd scrupulously maintained separation between his company's finances and the marital estate. Not a single dollar of Innovatech revenue had ever been commingled with their joint accounts, and Preston had even continued paying high share of household expenses from his official salary rather than his business profits. The final blow came when Judge Hernandez addressed the division of marital assets. The house in Coral Gables, which Melissa had assumed she would keep, had been purchased by Preston 2 years before their marriage using money he'd earned from an earlier software project. The mortgage had been paid down using funds from his official salary, with no contribution from Melissa's income or Preston's business profits. Even their shared checking account contained only modest savings from their combined salaries, not the substantial nest egg that Melissa had expected to find. As the judge announced her decision, Melissa's carefully constructed future crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. No house, no spousal support, no claim to the business that had made her husband a multi-millionaire while she'd been busy planning her escape. She would leave the marriage with exactly what she'd brought into it: her personal belongings, her car, and whatever savings she'd accumulated from her own income. The luxury apartment she'd already rented, the furniture she'd purchased on credit, the divorce party she'd planned for that weekend. All of it would have to be canceled or somehow funded from resources that had just evaporated. The most expensive lessons in life are often the ones that teach us the difference between what we want and what we actually deserve. How do you rebuild your life when you discover that everything you thought you knew about your situation was completely wrong? Conclusion. Preston Martinez walked out of that Miami courthouse not as a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge, but as a man who'd simply allowed the truth to speak for itself. He'd never lied to Melissa about his business success. He'd simply chosen not to volunteer information that she'd never bothered to ask about. While she'd been busy creating elaborate deceptions to hide her affair, he'd been building something real, something lasting, something that would outlive any marriage built on assumptions rather than genuine partnership. The story of Preston and Melissa isn't really about money, though the financial consequences were certainly dramatic. It's about the fundamental difference between people who build value and people who consume it, between those who plan for the long term, and those who live for immediate gratification. Melissa had chosen excitement over stability, passion over partnership, and deception over honesty. Preston had chosen patience over pride, preparation over performance, and strategic thinking over emotional reaction. What makes this story particularly powerful is that Preston never became the villain of his own life. He didn't seek to destroy Melissa or humiliate her publicly. He simply protected what he'd built while allowing her to reveal her true character through her own choices. The most devastating form of justice isn't revenge, it's consequences. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, the kindest thing you can do is believe them and respond accordingly. The real lesson here isn't about hiding assets or protecting yourself from unfaithful spouses. It's about understanding that your value as a person isn't determined by how others choose to treat you, but by how you choose to build your life regardless of their treatment. Preston's success came from focusing on what he could control: his work, his integrity, his long-term planning, rather than trying to change someone who'd already decided he wasn't worth her faithfulness. Today, Preston runs a technology company worth over $30 million, lives with a woman who chose him for his character rather than his bank account, and sleeps peacefully every night knowing that his success was built on solid foundations rather than borrowed time. Melissa learned the hard way that you can't build a future on someone else's foundation while simultaneously destroying the relationship that provides access to that foundation. So ask yourself, are you building something real in your life? Or are you just managing appearances? Are you choosing partners who see your actual value, or people who only appreciate what you might provide for them? Are you playing the long game with integrity, or the short game with deception? Because in the end, the truth always reveals itself, and when it does, you want to be standing on the right side of your own story. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are countless more stories of ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things through patience, planning, and the quiet confidence that comes from building something real. Share this with someone who needs to hear that success is often silent until it's ready to speak. And if you truly enjoyed this story,